The pre-dawn sky over the English Channel was alive with thunder on June 6, 1944. Not the thunder of storms, but the roar of over 5,000 ships carrying more than 150,000 souls toward the Nazi-occupied shores of France. The largest armada in human history sailed through choppy waters, many men aboard emptying their stomachs from seasickness and fear. For these soldiers, sailors, and airmen, this day would determine the fate of civilization itself. This was D-Day, the beginning of Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Normandy. Among those men was 22-year-old Private Robert Hillman from Nebraska, clutching a waterproofed photograph of his sweetheart as his landing craft approached Omaha Beach. "I kept thinking this might be the last time I'd look at her face," he would later recall to war correspondent Ernie Pyle. The whole world seemed to be exploding around us. The massive invasion had been years in planning, with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt agreeing that opening a Western front in Europe was essential to defeating Hitler's Germany. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower had postponed the operation by a day due to poor weather conditions, but could wait no longer. The message he sent to the troops that morning was simple, but powerful. "You are about to embark upon the Great Crusade, toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you." This context is taken from Eisenhower's historical pre-invasion message to Allied forces, preserved in the National Archives. As dawn broke over the Normandy coastline, the Germans manning their Atlantic Wall fortifications could scarcely believe what they saw. Despite Hitler's boasts that his defenses were impenetrable, despite Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's meticulous preparation of beach obstacles and minefields, despite the thousands of bunkers and artillery emplacements, the Allies were coming, and in force that defied imagination. The Americans had been assigned two beaches codenamed Utah and Omaha. The British would land at Golden Sword beaches, while the Canadians would assault Juneau. But it was at Omaha Beach where the bloodiest fighting would unfold. The first wave hit the beaches at 6:30 in the morning. At Utah, the American 4th Infantry Division landed off target, but ironically, found themselves facing lighter resistance than expected. Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., son of the former president, and at 56 the oldest man in the invasion, made the fateful decision: "We'll start the war from right here." But at Omaha Beach, the scene was apocalyptic. The pre-landing bombardment had failed to destroy the German defenses. Landing craft approached a shoreline that seemed to erupt with murderous fire. German gunners in concrete bunkers swept the beach with machine guns, their fire lanes perfectly positioned to create killing zones. Artillery shells crashed among the landing craft. Men leapt from boats into water over their heads, drowning under the weight of their equipment before reaching shore. Colonel George Taylor of the 1st Infantry Division, the legendary Big Red One, rallied his men with words that would become immortal. "Two kinds of people are staying on this beach, the dead and those who are going to die. Now let's get the hell out of here." Sergeant Thomas Wilson from Virginia described the chaos. "The ramp went down, and all hell broke loose. The guys in front were hit immediately. I saw bodies tumbling, water turning red. But we had no choice. We had to move forward. Every inch of sand seemed to explode around us. Against impossible odds, small groups of men began to organize. Demolition. Teams cleared paths through beach obstacles. Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes packed with explosives, were pushed under barbed wire to blow gaps. Navy destroyers, seeing the disaster unfolding, moved perilously close to shore to fire directly into German positions. By mid-morning, the Americans were establishing tiny footholds and beginning the brutal climb up the bluffs overlooking the beach. Hour by bloody hour, the invasion forces pushed forward. By nightfall, despite casualties numbering in the thousands, the beaches had been secured. The Allies had gained their foothold in Western Europe, but this was only the beginning. Dawn broke on June 7th to reveal a transformed Normandy coastline. What had been Hitler's impregnable Atlantic Wall was now a vast supply depot, with ships unloading men and material at a feverish pace. The beachheads secured during the previous day's bloodshed were rapidly expanding, though German resistance remained fierce along certain sectors. Lieutenant James Harwood of the 29th Infantry Division watched the endless stream of reinforcements pouring onto Omaha Beach. "Yesterday, this was the most dangerous place on Earth," he wrote in his journal. "Today, it's become an American port in France. The transformation is nothing short of miraculous. Indeed, the engineering feats accomplished in the wake of the initial assault were as impressive as the invasion itself." The Allies had prepared for this massive logistical challenge by creating 2 artificial harbors, codenamed Mulberry, that were towed across the English Channel in sections. Prefabricated concrete caissons, each weighing thousands of tons, were sunk to create breakwaters. Floating piers extended to the shore, allowing for rapid unloading of vehicles and supplies regardless of tides. This context is taken from engineering reports documented in The Longest Day by Cornelius Ryan. Meanwhile, the push inland had begun. In earnest, the American forces driving from Utah Beach linked up with paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, who had dropped behind enemy lines hours before the seaborne landings. Despite being scattered across the Norman countryside, some units landing miles from their designated drop zones, these elite airborne forces had performed remarkable feats during the night, capturing key crossroads and bridges, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the beaches. Corporal David Kenyon Webster of the 101st Airborne later recounted, "We were lost, disorganized, but somehow effective. Small groups of paratroopers who'd never trained together were taking out German positions, cutting communications lines, raising absolute hell behind enemy lines. The Germans, initially stunned by the scale and location of the invasion, were now mobilizing their response. Field Marshal Rommel had been away from the front, visiting his wife in Germany for her birthday when the invasion began, a critical stroke of luck for the Allies. Hitler, convinced the Normandy landings were merely a diversion and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, initially refused to release the panzer divisions held in reserve. By the time German high command recognized the true nature of the Allied strategy, precious hours had been lost. Yet German resistance stiffened as units of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, fanatical teenagers trained from childhood in Nazi ideology, moved into position. These young soldiers, averaging just 17 years of age, would earn a reputation for both battlefield effectiveness and shocking brutality. In the Norman hedgerow country beyond the beaches, a landscape of small fields enclosed by ancient earthen banks topped with dense vegetation, the advance slowed to a crawl. These bocages created perfect defensive terrain, with each field a potential death trap for advancing Allied forces. American Sherman tanks designed for open terrain found themselves vulnerable in this close-quarters fighting. Sergeant Frank McCall of the 2nd Armored Division described the challenge. Every hedgerow was a battle. You couldn't see the enemy until you were right on top of them. They'd let us get halfway across a field, then open up from 3 sides. We'd lose men, pull back, call in artillery, try again. It was like fighting through a maze where every wrong turn meant death. By the end of the first week after D-Day, the Americans had captured the vital port of Cherbourg, though the Germans had thoroughly demolished its facilities before surrender. The British forces pushing toward Caen encountered fierce resistance from German panzer units. The Battle of Normandy was evolving from the desperate fight for the beaches into a grinding campaign of attrition. Yet the strategic situation now undeniably favored the Allies. With each passing day, their numerical and material superiority increased as more divisions crossed the Channel. The German forces, unable to replace their losses, found themselves fighting an enemy with seemingly limitless resources. In the skies above, Allied air superiority was absolute, with fighter bombers making daylight movement a dangerous proposition for German units. The price of this advantage was measured in graves. In village churchyards across Normandy, rows of fresh crosses marked the resting places of young Americans who had helped purchase this foothold in Hitler's Europe. But there was no turning back now. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. By mid-June, the American forces in Normandy had secured their beachheads and were battling through the treacherous hedgerow country toward the key transportation hub of St. Lo. The fighting had evolved into a grueling contest where every field, every village, and every crossroad was contested with desperate ferocity. The bocage landscape proved to be an unexpected blessing for the defending Germans and a nightmare for American tank commanders. Sherman tanks, vulnerable to ambush in the confined spaces between hedgerows, were suffering heavy losses to German anti-tank weapons. In a remarkable display of battlefield innovation, American sergeants and officers developed a solution: welding steel prongs, salvaged from German beach obstacles, to their tanks. These makeshift devices, nicknamed rhino tanks, could now punch through the ancient hedgerows rather than exposing their vulnerable undersides by climbing over them. It was the kind of problem-solving that showed what made the American Army different, noted war correspondent Ernie Pyle. Some sergeant with a welding torch figured out in 10 minutes what all our pre-invasion planning hadn't considered. This context is taken from Ernie Pyle's frontline dispatches, published in Brave Men. Meanwhile, the skies above Normandy trembled with the constant drone of aircraft. Operation Point Blank, the strategic bombing campaign against German industrial and military targets, continued unabated. But now Allied tactical aircraft, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, and RAF Typhoons, were engaged in the direct support of ground operations, a role that would become increasingly important as the campaign progressed. Lieutenant Charles MacDonald, a P-38 pilot, described hunting German vehicles in the Norman countryside. "We'd fly so low, you could see the expressions on the Germans' faces when they realized we'd spotted them. Their trucks would swerve off the road looking for cover that wasn't there. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, but these fish shot back." The weather, which had briefly cooperated for the invasion, turned against the Allies in late June. A massive storm in the English Channel, the worst in 40 years, raged for 3 days, destroying one of the precious Mulberry harbors and severely damaging the other. Landing craft were smashed against the shore, and the flow of supplies was temporarily disrupted. General Eisenhower, visiting the beaches during this crisis, worried that this natural disaster might accomplish what the Germans had failed to do: push the Allies back into the sea. Yet the American Supply Corps performed near miracles to keep the front lines supplied. When conventional methods failed, they improvised. The Red Ball Express, a round-the-clock convoy system of trucks driven primarily by African-American soldiers, began ferrying supplies from the beaches to the advancing front lines, their headlights illuminating the dusty Norman roads each night. On the German side, resources were stretched increasingly thin. Hitler continued to believe that the Normandy invasion was a feint and that a larger landing would come at Pas-de-Calais. He ordered the 15th Army to remain in position there, effectively removing these forces from the critical battle field. Marshal Rommel, now back at his headquarters, argued vehemently for reinforcements, warning that without them, the battle for France would be lost. The human cost continued to mount on both sides. American field hospitals worked around the clock, with medical personnel performing near miracles of battlefield surgery. Medic Eugene Rowe of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment recalled, "We were treating boys who should have been dead by any medical standard, but they refused to die. They'd look at you with these young eyes and say, 'Fix me up, Doc, I need to get back to my buddies.'" The courage was unbelievable. By the end of June, despite the terrible cost, the American forces had expanded their beachhead to a depth of nearly 15 miles in some sectors. St. Lo, the capital of ruins, as it would come to be known due to the devastating bombardment it suffered, lay within striking distance. The capture of this strategic crossroads would be essential for the major offensive that American commanders were now planning, Operation Cobra. In the Norman villages behind the lines, a complex relationship was developing between the American liberators and the French civilians. After 4 years of German occupation, the arrival of the Americans represented freedom, but also brought destruction as battles raged through their ancient communities. Staff Sergeant Robert Johnson of Military Intelligence described how French children would follow American soldiers, hoping for chocolate and chewing gum, while their parents watched with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension, wondering what price their liberation would ultimately demand. As June gave way to July, the Battle of Normandy entered a new phase. The beachhead had been secured, but the decisive breakthrough remained elusive. The Americans prepared for a major offensive that would either break the stalemate or lead to yet more bloody attritional warfare in the hedgerow country. The summer heat of July 1944 bore down on the Norman countryside as American forces positioned themselves for Operation Cobra, a massive offensive designed to finally break through the German defensive line south of St. Lo. General Omar Bradley, commanding the American First Army, had conceived a bold plan. Concentrate overwhelming air and artillery power on a narrow front, pulverize the German defenses, and push armored divisions through the resulting gap. On July 25th, after weather delays that had frustrated earlier attempts, over 1,500 American heavy bombers and 500 medium bombers descended on a 5-mile stretch of German lines. The earth shook as over 4,000 tons of explosives transformed the landscape. German soldiers who survived described the experience as beyond human comprehension. The air itself seemed to catch fire, oxygen was sucked from their lungs, and concussion waves liquefied internal organs even in men who showed no external injuries. Major Robert Capa, the renowned war photographer who captured the horrific scenes of Omaha Beach on D-Day, was present for the bombing. "I've seen artillery, barrages, naval bombardments, but nothing could prepare anyone for this. It wasn't warfare as we understood it. It was the apocalypse." This context is taken from Robert Capa's wartime memoir, Slightly Out of Focus. The massive bombing, though devastating to the German defenders, also caused American casualties through short drops. Most tragically, Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking American officers in Europe, was killed by errant American bombs while observing the operation. Despite these setbacks, Operation Cobra achieved its primary objective: shattering German defenses and creating an opportunity for breakthrough. The American 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, followed by infantry, pushed through the bombed corridor. Initially, progress was slower than hoped as they encountered dazed but still fighting German survivors and navigated a cratered moonscape that the bombing had created. But by July 27th, the Americans had broken into open country beyond the hedgerows. General George S. Patton, who had been waiting impatiently in England, his presence there part of an elaborate deception plan to convince the Germans that the main invasion was yet to come, now arrived to take command of the newly activated Third Army. Patton's entrance into the battle would transform the campaign. Patton was like a force of nature, recalled Lieutenant Colonel Crichton Abrams, a tank battalion commander who would later become U.S. Army Chief of Staff. He appeared at our positions in his polished helmet, ivory-handled pistols gleaming, and suddenly everyone felt like we couldn't lose. The man radiated confidence and aggression. On August 1st, Patton's forces broke out of the Normandy pocket and began racing across France. The Germans, their defensive line shattered, attempted to contain the breakthrough, but lacked the mobile reserves to counterattack effectively. Hitler, still refusing to acknowledge strategic reality, ordered his commanders to hold position rather, then conduct an orderly withdrawal to more defensible lines. This fateful decision led to the Falaise Pocket, one of the most decisive battles of the Normandy campaign. As American forces swept east and then north, and British and Canadian forces pushed south, up to 50,000 German troops found themselves trapped in a shrinking cauldron. The Allied air forces turned the pocket into a killing zone, attacking anything that moved during daylight hours. Colonel Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division, who managed to escape the encirclement with a small portion of his command, later wrote, "It was a vision of hell. Destroyed vehicles lined every road. The bodies of men and horses lay everywhere. The air was thick with the smell of death and burning fuel. It was the death of an army." By August 21st, the Battle of WWII, Normandy was effectively over. The Germans had suffered a catastrophic defeat, losing over 400,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The Allied forces had suffered approximately 200,000 casualties, a terrible toll, but one that their superior resources could absorb. Paris would be liberated on August 25th, and the Allied armies would push to the German border by September. For the American soldiers who had stormed the beaches on that June morning, the objectives had been achieved beyond most expectations. Private Robert Hillman, whom we met clutching his sweetheart's photograph as he approached Omaha Beach, survived to write her, "We did it, darling. It cost us dearly, but we did it. I've seen things no man should ever see, but I've also seen courage that makes me proud to be an American. The war isn't over, but Hitler has lost France, and he knows it. The strategic significance of the Normandy campaign cannot be overstated. It had established the long-awaited Second Front, forcing Hitler to fight a two-front war against the combined might of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union. The clock was now ticking on the Third Reich, though months of hard fighting still lay ahead. As autumn approached in 1944, the Allied armies raced across France, liberating towns and villages at an astonishing pace. The Normandy campaign had broken the back of German resistance in Western Europe, and now General Eisenhower faced a crucial strategic decision. Should the Allied forces advance on a broad front toward Germany, or should they concentrate their resources for a single powerful thrust that might end the war by Christmas? British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery advocated passionately for the latter approach, arguing that his 21st Army Group should receive priority for supplies and fuel to enable a rapid advance through the Netherlands and into Germany's industrial heartland, the Ruhr. General Patton, commanding the American Third Army, countered that his forces should be given priority to drive through Lorraine and into southern Germany. Eisenhower, conscious of both military and political considerations, chose a compromise, a broad front strategy that would keep pressure on the Germans along the entire front while preventing rivalries between the Allied armies. This decision, though strategically sound, meant that no single Allied army group would have sufficient resources for a knockout blow. The consequences of this decision became apparent as Allied supply lines stretched thin. The rapid advance across France had outrun the carefully planned logistics network. Gasoline, ammunition, and food became scarce commodities at the front lines. At one point, Patton's Third Army had to halt its advance when its tanks literally ran out of fuel within sight of their objectives. Captain James Hornfisher of the Quartermaster Corps described the challenge. "We were victims of our own success. The supply system was designed to support an advance of maybe 5 miles per day. Instead, we were covering 20 or 30 miles. Every extra mile meant more fuel consumed just delivering supplies to the front." This context is taken from official U.S. Army logistical reports compiled in Supplying War by historian Martin van Creveld. The Allied advance began to slow as German resistance stiffened along the borders of the Reich. The Wehrmacht, though, badly mauled in Normandy, remained a dangerous fighting force. Defending their homeland, German soldiers fought with renewed determination. Fresh divisions, including the elite panzer units that Hitler had been hoarding for a counteroffensive, moved into position. It was during this period that American forces first encountered Hitler's vaunted Siegfried Line, the West Wall, a series of bunkers, tank traps, and fortifications along Germany's western border. Initial encounters proved sobering. The concrete dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, reinforced bunkers, and interlocking fields of fire presented formidable challenges. Sergeant William Manchester of the 29th Infantry Division recalled his unit's first attempt to breach these defenses. "We'd gotten used to advancing to seeing the Germans retreat. Now suddenly we were attacking concrete that shot back. Men who'd survived Normandy were dying by the score. It was like D-Day all over again, but without the water." In September, Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden, an ambitious airborne assault designed to secure bridges over several rivers in the Netherlands, allowing ground forces to bypass the Siegfried Line and strike into Germany. The operation, immortalized in the book and film A Bridge Too Far, achieved initial success but ultimately failed to secure its final objective, the bridge at Arnhem. The narrow corridor created by the operation became a bloody battleground, with British airborne forces fighting against overwhelming odds. Meanwhile, American forces battling through the Hürtgen forest encountered some of the most difficult fighting of the war. This dense woodland along the German-Belgian border negated American advantages in mobility and air power. Artillery shells exploded in the treetops, showering soldiers with lethal wooden splinters. Mines and booby traps made every step hazardous. The battle, which stretched from September into December, cost over 30,000 American casualties for minimal strategic gain. Lieutenant Paul Fussell, who fought in the Hürtgen, later wrote, "It was warfare reduced to its most primitive. We couldn't see more than 20 yards in any direction. We lived in muddy foxholes, soaked to the skin, fighting an enemy we rarely saw. Men died from tree bursts, from mines, from exposure, from combat exhaustion. The forest itself seemed to be the enemy. On the home front, Americans followed the European campaign with intense interest. Newspapers printed maps showing the Allied advance, while newsreels in theaters showed triumphant American soldiers liberating French towns to cheering crowds. War bond drives emphasized that victory was coming, but would require continued sacrifice and support. President Roosevelt, running for an unprecedented fourth term in the 1944 election, campaigned on the promise of seeing the war through to complete victory. His Republican opponent, Thomas Dewey, was careful not to criticize the war effort directly, focusing instead on domestic issues and subtly suggesting that a new administration might prosecute the war more efficiently. By November, as Americans prepared to vote, the Allied army stood poised along Germany's western frontier. The stunning advances of the summer had given way to grinding attritional warfare reminiscent of the First World War. German propaganda spoke of secret weapons that would turn the tide, while Allied commanders prepared for what they knew would be a difficult final push into the Nazi homeland. The Battle of Normandy had opened the door to Germany's defeat, but the final chapters of the European war would demand even greater sacrifice from the young Americans who had stormed those blood-soaked beaches 5 months earlier. As 1944 drew to a close, Allied commanders believed the Wehrmacht was on the verge of collapse. Intelligence reports suggested German reserves were exhausted, fuel was scarce, and morale was crumbling. Victory seemed tantalizingly close. Few suspected that Adolf Hitler was marshaling his remaining strength for one final desperate gamble in the West. On December 16th, under cover of thick fog that neutralized Allied air superiority, 30 German divisions, including the elite panzer units Hitler had been hoarding, struck through the Ardennes forest of Belgium and Luxembourg. The target was the thinly held American lines in what was considered a quiet sector of the front. The ultimate objective was the port of Antwerp, whose capture would split the Allied armies and potentially force a negotiated peace. The attack achieved complete tactical surprise. American units, many composed of inexperienced replacements or battle-weary veterans rotated to a quiet sector for rest, found themselves overwhelmed by the sudden onslaught. The German advance created a bulge in the American lines, giving the battle its enduring name, the Battle of the Bulge. In the crucial early hours, German commandos in American uniforms infiltrated behind the lines, cutting communications wires, changing road signs, and spreading confusion. Small American units found themselves isolated, surrounded, and fighting for survival in the freezing winter conditions. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, American soldiers displayed remarkable resilience. Nowhere was this more evident than in the besieged town of Bastogne, a critical road junction that the Germans needed to secure for their advance. Elements of the 101st Airborne Division, rushed to the town as the crisis developed, found themselves surrounded. When German officers delivered a surrender ultimatum, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe gave a response that would become legendary for its defiance. Nuts. Major Richard Winters of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment recalled the siege. We were short on everything: ammunition, medical supplies, food, winter clothing. Men were dying of wounds that wouldn't have been fatal with proper medical care. But no one talked about surrender. We'd been through too much since Normandy to give up now. This context is taken from Beyond Band of Brothers, Major Winters' personal memoir. The German offensive, though initially successful, soon began to falter. Stubborn American resistance at key roadblocks and crossroads slowed the advance. Fuel shortages, the very problem the Germans had hoped to solve by capturing Allied supply dumps, began to hamper their operations. Most critically, the weather cleared on December 23rd, allowing Allied aircraft to pound the exposed German columns. General Patton, demonstrating remarkable flexibility, pivoted his Third Army 90 degrees from its previous line of advance and march to the relief of Bastogne. This maneuver, executed in winter conditions with minimal planning time, stands as one of the most impressive operational achievements of the war. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The Germans had been pushed back to their starting positions, having expended irreplaceable reserves of men, tanks, and aircraft. The cost had been high for the Americans. As well, over 75,000 casualties, but the strategic situation now overwhelmingly favored the Allies. With the failure of Hitler's last gamble in the West, the final Allied offensive into Germany began. American forces crossed the Rhine at Remagen in March, when German defenders failed to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge before it was captured. Eisenhower's armies advanced into the German heartland, liberating concentration camps whose horrors confirmed the moral necessity of the war. As American and Soviet forces approached Berlin from west and east, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker on April 30th. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945, just over 11 months after the Normandy landings. For the young Americans who had waded ashore on D-Day, the war's end brought mixed emotions. Joy at survival and victory was tempered by grief for fallen comrades and awareness of how close the outcome had sometimes hung in the balance. Private Robert Hillman, whose journey we have followed from the landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, returned to Nebraska with a Purple Heart, a Bronze Star, and memories that would both haunt and inspire him for the rest of his life. Like many veterans, he rarely spoke about his experiences until late in life, when he began sharing his story with schoolchildren and historical societies. "We weren't heroes," he insisted in an interview for the Veterans History Project in 2001. "We were just doing our job. The real heroes were the ones who never came home." The legacy of D-Day and the subsequent campaign extends far beyond military history. Operation Overlord represented American industrial might, logistical genius, and fighting spirit at their finest. It demonstrated the nation's commitment to liberating oppressed peoples and defeating tyranny, even at tremendous cost. The rows of white crosses and stars of David in the American cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach stand as silent testimony to that sacrifice. In the decades following the war, the bonds forged between the United States and the liberated nations of Western Europe would shape global politics and economics. The Marshall Plan would rebuild a devastated continent, while the NATO alliance would stand guard against new threats. For France, and particularly Normandy, the American liberation created an enduring connection. French families still maintain the graves of their liberators, passing the responsibility down through generations. Children in Norman villages continue to learn about the young Americans who crossed an ocean to free a land many had never seen before. On the 50th anniversary of D-Day in 1994, President Bill Clinton stood on Omaha Beach with aging veterans and declared, "These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These all are the heroes who helped end a war." From the blood-soaked sand of Normandy to the final victory in Europe, the American soldiers of World War II had demonstrated the truth of the words inscribed at the memorial overlooking Omaha Beach. "To these we owe the high resolve that the cause for which they died shall live."